Hello. I'm going to be posting a couple of videos, 2 or 3 videos that I recorded a while ago and just forgot to post. So if you're like, looks like her hair got longer and rattier or something like that, it's because it's an old video. You might not notice, doesn't really matter. So this video is about insulin. I should have already made a video on insulin, and I'm just gonna try to keep it focused on the basics because I love the topic of circadian hormones. Insulin is one of them. So let's just start out with that. Insulin is a circadian hormone, which means it is regulated by the circadian rhythm. Our circadian clock is just a time-released clock that is dictated by light, and it's our sleep and wake cycle, and eating impacts it, and light exposure significantly impacts our circadian rhythm and our circadian clock. This clock regulates the release of certain hormones like cortisol, leptin, and insulin is one of them as well. Insulin resistance is when you've pulled the trigger too many times. What do I mean? Pretend your pancreas is a trigger. When you eat foods high in carbohydrates or even a bolus of protein, it triggers the pancreas to release insulin because insulin's job is to put nutrients into the cell, and it is also to lower blood sugar. And so when you eat foods that cause a spike in your blood glucose, it also causes a spike in insulin. Now that's a true statement, but what's also true is that there are things that don't necessarily spike your glucose that still spike insulin. This is just a side note, a little blip. Things like Zevia. 0 calories, doesn't spike your blood sugar because it's sweetened with stevia, but it still causes a cephalic insulin response, and it still sends a signal to the brain that there is something coming in. And so it still will cause insulin secretion, which can result in hypoglycemia. Because if something is not raising your blood sugar, but it is raising your insulin, and insulin's job is to push your sugar down, that means your sugar is just going to go down. I used to put myself into hypoglycemia unknowingly drinking Zevias when I was fasting especially. Same thing can happen with chewing 0-calorie gum. Now, back to the basics. That was a side blip. Insulin resistance happens when you pull that trigger too many times, and basically that trigger just becomes less sensitive. Your pancreas starts to secrete more and more insulin to effectively lower blood sugar because that trigger has been pulled constantly and it's just not working as effectively. So your body produces more and more insulin. And what happens is someone can end up in a state of hyperinsulinemia when there's just too much insulin being secreted. That doesn't happen unless that trigger has been pulled too many times. So what do I mean? Someone who is eating way too many carbs and not giving a place for those carbohydrates to go. So like if someone's doing powerlifting or resistance training, they are depleting their glycogen stores, which makes room for glucose. And so someone who's just done a heavy training session has a higher capacity to consume carbohydrates because that energy is not going to be floating around in the bloodstream. When you eat a bunch of energy and it's just floating around in your bloodstream, your body needs something to do with it. So if you haven't depleted your glycogen stores, if you haven't given your body something to do with it, insulin has to effectively lower your blood sugar. Otherwise, you just have high blood sugars, and that's diabetes. When your body is becoming less and less efficient at producing adequate amounts of insulin to lower the blood sugar. So I hope I described that well. It makes sense in my mind. I hope I'm describing it well. It's when the trigger has been pulled too many times. So how do we reverse insulin resistance? Well, stop pulling the trigger so much. Doing low carb is a really great way to enhance insulin sensitivity and to reduce insulin resistance. Getting adequate protein. Now, a lot of people will say, well, shouldn't I lower protein because protein raises insulin? Doing too much protein can be a problem, but adequate protein is actually key. Protein and fat play a major role in insulin sensitivity. I used to be of the mindset that high fat and pretty low protein was the best place to be. I was wrong because insulin is a good thing and we need a decent amount of insulin, and insulin resistance can also occur if you're under eating protein. Insulin resistance can also occur if you're fasting too much. Insulin resistance can occur if you're underweight. For me, when I was 69 pounds, I had insulin resistance because I didn't have muscle on my body. When I think of insulin resistance, I usually picture people who are overweight, not moving a lot, sedentary. I don't picture people who are underweight. You know, people would see me and be like, "Ooh, are you a dancer? You're so lean." And I'd be like, "No, I'm literally fighting for my life, but thank you." So insulin resistance can occur being under-muscled as well. Protein is essential for insulin sensitivity. It's also essential for leptin sensitivity. 1 gram of protein per pound of desired or healthy body weight is a really good range of protein. And I have said this in so many videos because it's true. Reversing insulin resistance, other things that are important. Not fasting too much is important. I think intermittent fasting is a great way to find balance. Fasting 16 hours and then eating in an 8-hour eating window. I also believe that many people are making the mistake of trying to fast as long as possible after they wake up, like pushing their first meal out, drinking coffee so they're suppressing their appetite. I would prefer, or I should say what I believe is optimal is eating within the first hour of waking up. Eating with the morning sun, because that morning sunlight exposure in your eyes actually raises leptin sensitivity and insulin sensitivity. And the longer that you prolong that first meal, the higher and higher your cortisol levels will rise. So it's better, in my opinion, to blunt that cortisol from continuing to rise, because excess cortisol and excess stress contributes to insulin resistance. So 8-hour eating window, start your day off strong with a great meal. OMAD, I don't think it's a good idea. Too much insulin in one sitting. When I work with type 1 diabetics, they do horribly with OMAD. They do really well with what I just said, eating within 1 hour of waking with the morning sun, and 3 meals, equally distributing protein and fat throughout those 3 meals within an 8-hour eating window, because it requires a lot more insulin to cover all your food in 1 meal versus 3 smaller meals. And you wouldn't think so. Everyone's like, "Ooh, OMAD has to be the best for losing weight." Only if you're in an energy deficit, and you can only do that for so long before your metabolism downregulates, and it's not a good thing. Resistance training is awesome for reversing insulin resistance and for more insulin sensitivity. And resistance training creates hormesis, whereas cardiovascular exercise can raise cortisol, and it doesn't do much for hormones. You can get endorphins. It's good for cognitive abilities. But in terms of hormesis and insulin sensitivity, putting resistance on your muscles and depleting those glycogen stores puts us into a more insulin sensitive state. And there are other incredible things that happen with resistance training. It's an antidepressant. It does release endorphins. It's obviously builds muscle, which creates more insulin sensitivity. Getting a minimum of 5 grams of sodium every day is what I would recommend. We need sodium for insulin sensitivity. If I'm dehydrated, I do notice my blood sugars can fluctuate a little bit. So hydration, adequate sodium intake is really important. Managing stress is really important. Stress contributes to insulin resistance. It interferes with the signaling between our brains and our pancreas and insulin sensitivity. Stress interferes in a great way. Sleep hygiene is huge. 1 poor night of sleep can lead someone to be as insulin resistant as a type 2 diabetic, including myself. So even though we have a baby who sleeps with us, I still do my very best to get good quality sleep, decent quality sleep, and it's working okay. It's not perfect. But seriously, dialing in on your sleep hygiene is very important, because again, that ties into your circadian rhythm, which directly relates to insulin. Those are the main things I want to talk about to keep it in a bubble. So if you have questions, feel free to ask them. And yeah, I think that's all for now.